Hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Paul Burke. I write about fiction for Crime Time and MB Magazine and the European Literature Network. And well, welcome and good evening and good afternoon, because I think we have some people from other parts of the world here tonight as well. We're here for the launch of Cesare, which is the latest novel in the UK by Jerome Charyn. You can see Jerome on the screen there. Jerome is an author of over 50 books, over 5.5 decades now, which began in 1964 with Once Upon a Drushki. His first thriller was 1975, Blue Eyes, which is the first in the Isaac Siddle novels. He's an academic, currently living in New York, but he has lived in Paris and in Barcelona. He writes memoirs, novels, short stories, graphic novels, books on film, plays, and all sorts of other non-fiction as well. So it's quite a lot going on there. His writing's been described as audacious and ingenious, and he was described by the New York Newsday as a contemporary Balzac, which is quite a moniker to hang around your neck, that one, isn't it? So first of all, Jerome, congratulations on the publication of the new novel. Fantastic cover, by the way. I want to start by going back a little bit. I don't want to take you back to your childhood as such, but you're a Bronx boy. Your parents must have arrived when it was a ghetto, you know. But I'm interested in what you say and how this connects to the actual writing. And I'm interested in language. What you say about this is that you had no language in a sense.
No.
And could you explain what you mean by that, please?
Well, when you grow up in a ghetto and you grow up with immigrant parents who really don't speak English, I mean, you're like a wolf cub and you get your language from the streets. And your music comes from what you hear, from what you see. But, you know, when you're not in a middle class culture where there are books lined up everywhere and kids read, you know, War and Peace at the age of 7 or whatever it is. There were no books. I didn't know what a book was. I mean,
No books, no newspapers.
Nothing. There were comic books that I read comic books religiously, and I think that's how I learned to read. But what you did have, you see, in the absence of language, you have an imagination, and in that imagination, you know, sort of words begin to enter and you have all sorts of landscapes. And finally, when you come to a middle class culture, there's a kind of clash, but you see words in a very, very different way. The other people are taking words for granted. And as I went to high school, because I was lucky to get out of my neighborhood and go to what we call a special high school, which is the High School of Music and Art, I just began to listen the way other people spoke, and I absorbed their language and became like a kind of zombie. You know.
That's interesting, because what you're saying is, in a way, it's almost liberating, whereas I would have looked on it, my first thought was it's sort of a limiting process. But you're actually saying, in a kind of way, it was very liberating.
Well, you would think that it is a limiting thing, but finally it isn't, because I was the one with the imagination. You know, when I was in public school, when the teacher was so bored and didn't have anything to do, she would say, "Get up on a stool and tell us a story." Well, I would sit on the stool and just invent a story that went on and on and on, because it was all in my imagination. So sometimes what limits you makes you wild and makes you strong. And this is the strength that you keep. Of course, I also had to fight a lifelong depression, but that's another story. So when you come from a dysfunctional family, you have to survive the best you can. So I had the worst of worlds and the best of worlds. The best of worlds is that my imagination remained intact. And it's still here, even at this age.
Right. And that must be something that...
I'll tell you a story. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah.
So I was just thinking that also kicks into the thing about film, really, because obviously when you went to university, when you went to Columbia, you're reading, like everybody does, you read everything you can get your hands on. But before that, you've got film. And in a way, that's another thing that feeds into your imagination. And I'm just wondering...
Absolutely. I learned how to eat because, you know, the way we ate at home, we all ate with our fingers. But I learned, you know, seeing Cary Grant and Katharine Hepburn eating with knives and forks, and you see people kiss, you see the way they're dressing. So I just have a very strange visual memory. I mean, I can recognize a face. I mean, there was an actor by the name of Joseph Wiseman, and I
Yeah.
was walking in the street, and he was in a film called Viva Zapata, and 30 years later, I saw the back of his head, and I knew it was that particular actor.
That is remarkable. Yeah.
Visual acuity. Some people, I was speaking to Joyce Carol Oates, and she said, no, it's not strange at all, because her husband was a neuroscientist, and she said, some people have that kind of...
Yeah. Well, the police are using these things now. They call super recognizers, aren't they?
Yeah. I was a super forgetter and a super recognizer.
I'm just thinking then, so this plays into your fiction, doesn't it, really? When you're writing, really, that's the point.
Yeah.
And so how does it play into your writing? I mean, it's is it actually sort of that it's very visual? It feels very visual. It feels
well,
very...
You can, for example, the Cesare is about Nazi Germany. I should, without taking up too much time, I would say, I mean, people say, well, you write a book once a year, but this took me 10 years to write, because I had all sorts of versions, and it was supposed to be about a Nazi spy who came to America, and 30 years later he's a sheriff in an American town, and I began writing. It just didn't come alive. So I said, well, I'll go back into his past. And once I went into Germany and brought him back to that landscape, everything came alive. So what, you always have to think about, how do you bring life to the page? And that's a kind of miracle. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And
sorry. I was going to say, last kind of question on that was just about this theory of music. Lots of writers have style, lots of writers have patterns and flows that you can follow in their work. But what do you mean by music when you're talking about your own work?
Well, the rhythm of a sentence. I mean, all a book is a series of sentences, and the sentences, have a certain kind of music. And the first, it's like playing musical scales. The first musician I learned from was James Joyce, who wrote perfect sentences. If you look at any of his sentences, there's a kind of rhythm.
Yeah.
We all have words. So what distinguishes us is the placement of the words and the use of the words. Otherwise, we would all be writing the same sentences, like Jack Nicholson in, what is that film? No, the one, the Stephen King film.
Oh, Misery. Not Misery, Shining.
The Shining, if you remember.
Yeah.
He's writing a novel, and all he has is one sentence that he repeats over and over again. Well, what you're trying to do is not write that sentence over and over again, to find new ways of describing what you see, so that you have, and landscape is particularly important. That is the landscape of Germany in the 30s and the 40s became much more familiar to me than the landscape I see outside my window. So it's just finding the visual side, and the movies were very important, because I learned how to speak and to look by watching films. I saw every single film that was made, let's say from the year of 1940 to about 1955, because if you went to two movie chains, you saw the whole Hollywood product with 4 films, because you always had a double feature. And if you went to both chains, you saw everything that was made in a particular year. And the impression was incredible. It stayed with me.
I want to talk about this just for a second, actually. This book here was the, as far as I know, was the first publication of the Isaac Siddle novels in the UK.
Yes, it was.
These are your thrillers. You've written several of them since. This is the 4 in the quartet that Maxim put together in the early 80s.
Maxim was a wonderful series, a black box series, and I was very happy to be in it. And of course, I came to London for the publication.
Well, hopefully again, hopefully. But I was thinking about that. I mean, one of the big influences on you there, you said, was Ross MacDonald.
Yes.
I want to combine that thought with something you actually said also about, and I think this relates very much to the way you write the books, to sabotage the form,
Yes.
push it to the limits,
Yes.
to play with it, and yet to make it moving.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's a very hard task, but you take the form and you sort of dynamite it and extend it, and yet you still have to keep the reader involved and engaged, and that's no easy task.
is that when you kind of know the music's come together?
Yes, that's what happened when in the first version of the book, which took place in a western town. I wrote about 50 pages, and it just didn't work. I mean, I wasn't interested in it. I'm not interested in it. And then I said, okay, I'll bring him back to Nazi Germany and start with his childhood, and then that became the book. And then I had another version where Hitler was a character with Eva Braun, and I thought, okay, that's interesting, but why should I popularize Hitler and Eva Braun? I found it distasteful, even though it worked in the book. So this book, it took me 10 years to write, and I could never do another book like this again, So it's
Right, yeah. I'm not surprised. I mean, we'll get onto the content of the book as we go on, but I want to take it back just a little bit from that and actually discuss the concepts of history, because I'm hoping that if we can get through a few questions here, we can kind of get to see how you build the book around history. I mean, if I start off, I mean, both Cesare and Sergeant Salinger are historical books. They're biographical books as well. But if you look at them, there's a debate anyway about what is history. I mean, if you look at real history, you've got interpretation, you've got absences, you've got myths, you've got edits, you've got romances and distortions. History isn't the past. History is some kind of reimagining of the past.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, in terms of how you write, what you think history is in the context of your novels.
That's a very good question. For me, it's the backdrop of what I want to either put in or leave out. So that, let's say, I won't talk about Sergeant Salinger. I'll talk about Cesare. I mean, reading everything about Nazi Germany, and particularly there's a scene in a submarine. So I read everything about submarines and everything about World War II. So all it is plastic. History becomes a kind of plastic that you can sort of shape and reshape, even though you can't totally distort it. You have to keep some form of it there, but you can reshape it, as much as you want. And I read history when I was at college, and I studied particularly the 20th century. And I think that history is very sad. I mean, someone once said, your books are as sad as history. There is a sadness about it because we think we're moving forward, but if you look at the United States today, not only are we not moving forward, we've moved backwards. And that's a very sad commentary on what's happened to this country.
Just to pick up on a little bit more on this for the moment, you also write, you write fictions and you write non-fictions.
Yeah.
But I get the sense that, basically the divide between those two things is nowhere near as clear as people seem to think it is. And I'm just wondering for you, what is the difference when you write a biography of somebody like Isaac Babel or Hemingway, or if you actually wrote a fictional book about Teddy Roosevelt?
No, I don't think there is that much of a difference because you're still writing sentences. I mean, in the biographical form, you're limited by the historical facts, but you still have to shape the sentences. So it seems to me that the biography of Isaac Babel is another form of fiction. Some people might say metafiction, I don't know. is it really a biography? And one critic said, you're really not writing about Babel, you're writing about yourself. That's true. It's sort of writing about a twin. I fell in love with Babel's Benya Crick stories because they reminded me of the Bronx and his orange pants, etc., etc. And so it was a love song to Isaac Babel, and for me, it might just as well have been a novel.
Yeah, I think just one more question on that to slightly change it. You also wrote a book, The Secret Life of Emily Dickinson.
Right.
Which kind of got a bit of controversy around it,
right,
because you gave her sexuality.
right.
And when it comes, there's a thing everybody talks about when you write a novel. If you're looking at what's the difference between real history and a novelized history or a fictional history, and they say that what you can actually do is you can give somebody an inner life.
Yeah.
So you can add to the fact by doing that. But there's something else that I was reading something you wrote about this Emily Dickinson book, and it made me think. And if we just concentrate on that one thing about what you did in adding those sexuality back into her life,
Yeah.
was that's also the kind of thing that historians ignore.
Well,
And
they
so,
can't. It's not simply that they ignore it. They don't have the gift. Most historians don't have. You need that fictional gift, and you find it in very good historians like Doris Kearns Goodwin. I mean, when she does her books about Lincoln, he really comes alive. It's history, it's fiction. But what's lacking in, let's say, in all the Teddy Roosevelt books I read, he never came to life. So and also when I wrote The Secret Life of Emily Dickinson would have been much different had I known at that time that she was bisexual, but I didn't know that, so I only had to give, I hint at it. I hint at a kind of bisexuality, but as I discovered more and more, I mean, that would have been a very different kind of book. But it doesn't really matter. You are limited by what you have, and then you sort of fall into the narrative. The narrative becomes a kind of song. And also remember, books don't begin and they don't end. They continue after the last sentence. They continue in the reader's mind. And the reader continues to rewrite both the beginning and the end of a novel.
Yes. I mean, that gets us to a point, really. You're writing about real people in this book, and you're writing about real events. And so I think we've try to get to show people that history is quite a fluid thing to write about. I mean, a lot of it's memory and so on anyway.
Yeah.
And what you do is the facts do matter. I mean, that's the point.
Of course.
Yeah.
Unless you want to do science fiction, then you can do, if you want to have Hitler invade the United States or whatever it is. I mean, you're limited by certain things. Hitler lost the war. If I wanted to have Hitler win the Second World War, then I'd be writing science fiction. And I hate science fiction. So, I mean, that's not something that I would want to do. I can bend history to a certain degree, but I can't totally distort it.
But there are other ways of getting at the truth as well, aren't there?
Yes.
I mean, you create fictional characters, and I find those fictional characters tend to throw an awful lot of light on real characters.
Yes, in a good way. I mean, Cesare is a fictional character, though the Abwehr, German military intelligence, did exist, and Admiral Canaris did exist. He was torn. He's the one who invented the Yellow Star, and yet he also helped save many Jews at the same time. And he ended in a bad way. He was sort of hung up on a hook, and he died and was killed by the Nazis in 1944. What I do like is that it is Admiral Canaris, but it's Admiral Canaris from my point of view. It's the flesh that I choose to give him. It's the accent, it's the music, it's the nuance. that I want, that I see. I am the master here. I'm not a puppeteer, I'm the master. Sometimes the characters take off on their own and don't allow me to do certain things, but I'm always the master of the form. And these
Do
are
you
my,
do you have a I was going to say an issue, that's not the right word, but do characters keep coming? Do you get more characters and more characters? You write a
yes,
lot of characters.
people say that I do so. As a matter of fact, someone in France uh, did an article about the numbers of characters that I have in the Isaac Seidel novels, and he stopped counting after 2000. So you can see that, every page there are five characters. Well, that happens. You go into a room, there are five people, and you've got to introduce them and visualize them. You've got to make them come to life in some way. So I never stop inventing characters.
Yeah, I can see that. I just want to go back to something then, in the light, now that we've started talking about the novel, and just to talk about something about the United States and related to your Bronx and your upbringing and everything. And you said, in some ways, things haven't got better; they've actually got worse. Um,
Yes.
I think actually I saw an interview where you used the phrase Trumpism,
Yeah.
that we're stuck in this age of Trumpism. And I worry that America is very prone to demagogues and populist leaders. It sounds a bit funny, but you love to hate them with Hitler and Stalin and so on. But you have the preachers who have hundreds of thousands of people in their audiences, and Donald Trump is just taking us to another place. But I mean, how are things in America at the moment?
Terrible. Terrible. I mean, we're sort of in a make-believe land where we have a president-elect that can't even be certified by some woman who sits there and won't allow him to proceed. So we're hoping that it will be solved soon. But at the moment, we're in limbo. I mean, there are all these, you know, non-certifications. Election has been won, but hasn't been won.
Yeah.
Does the truth really matter anymore? I mean, we are in a very strange landscape. But the one beautiful thing is that Biden has no ambition whatsoever. He's not going to run again, and I do believe that if and when he's inaugurated, you will see a totally different country, and we'll get back to being normal again within 10 days. I'm
Yeah.
giving you my word for that. You know.
Okay. So we don't have to worry about the return of fascism then.
No, I don't think so. I don't think if he is inaugurated, where there is an element of doubt, at least in a novelist's mind. I can, that's one of the problems, because I was at a symposium yesterday where they were talking about anxiety, and depression. And it seems to me, as a novelist, I'm inventing 500 different landscapes, 500 different possibilities. But if and when Biden is inaugurated, I can guarantee you that he will be a great president, because he has no personal ambition. He will do whatever he can to solve the problems that not only the United States has, but that other countries have. I mean, the whole notion of what to do about the environment has to be solved very, very, very quickly. And it seems to me that it already feels too late, but I don't believe it is too late.
Yeah.
You will see a very, very different country. We do have good people.
No, America always has the best as well as some that's not so good.
Best, we also have the worst.
Yes,
But
well, you said it. I was trying to be polite.
yeah.
No, we'll leave it on
No,
that,
don't be
on
polite.
a slightly
You don't
positive
have to
note.
be polite. After all, this book is about Nazi Germany.
Well,
So,
let's tell people about the book. Do you want to introduce it?
well, this was a very strange book to me. It took me 10 years to write, as I said earlier, I began the book in the United States. It's 30 years after the war. Cesare is a sheriff of a Midwestern town, and nothing happened. I couldn't make the pages come alive, so I decided, well, I'll go back into his past. And the minute I brought him back into his past, it all began to work. And then when I'd already finished the book, I was suddenly introduced to Theresienstadt, this very strange concentration camp, which was supposed to be almost like a movie version of sort of Hollywood in the middle of nowhere, where Jews could buy into and live for the rest of their lives. And it was so surreal that I had to put it into the book, so I had to put in a different ending. And it took me a very, very long time to write this book. I don't think I could ever write another book with the same kind of density, it seems to me.
And you've got, if we take Eric Holderman, the main character,
right,
Cesare, in the book, because actually that's Canaris who kind of adopts him after an incident where he saves his life. And it's from the cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
Yeah.
Do you want to explain a little bit about that?
Well, I don't know, remember, I was also a teacher of film, and the cabinet of Dr. Caligari is one of the great silent films of all time. And Caligari is a madman who has this assistant called Cesare, who sort of sleeps in a coffin and then goes out and murders people. So Cesare, I mean, is really Admiral Canaris's, henchman, assassin. He's an assassin. Let's be, honest.
Yeah.
He goes to the Prado Museum, and he murders someone in the middle of a Goya exhibition. He does, but on the other hand, he's not soulless. He does have a kind of soul. He does have a kind of spirit. He was raised in a Jewish orphanage, though he was not Jewish. So there is this sort of strange mixture of races, and he's a character who dies at the end. And this is the ending that I love the best of all my books, because it is a dreamscape where you can no longer tell the difference between what's real and what's not real. And it took me a very long time, to write this. It took me, as I say, years and years, but I'm glad. You're never happy with what you do, but I'm as happy as I could be, and I also love the cover. The cover is...
It is a fantastic cover. Yeah. I mean, for me, one of the things I got from that analogy with the film was also, it was kind of like a description of the psychopathy of Nazism.
Yeah.
It kind of put that out there. So let's talk a little bit about, oh no, actually, I'll tell you what we do first. I think there's a couple of terms we need to explain for people. One of them is the U-boats, otherwise known as submarines or divers. And the other one is grabbers or searchers. You want to explain a little bit to people about what those are and the situation in Berlin that this comes about with?
Well, these griefers or grabbers were Jews who were in the employment of the Nazis, who would find Jews hiding in Berlin and would inform on them. And what one of Eric's tasks is that he meets one, and he's about to kill her, but he can't. Somehow this monster suddenly is no longer monstrous, and so she's also becomes part. I mean, think of it as an opera. She becomes the opera. She becomes part of the aria. That's and the U-boats are those, the submariners are those Jews who are hiding in Berlin. What people don't understand is that whatever Hitler was doing, Berlin was a Jewish city during the war. And what was one of the strange consequences is that you had German officers married to Jewish women, and these half Jews, were called Mischlinge, and it was a very strange city. Berlin was a very surreal city during the war, and when some of these Jews were being taken away, their husbands revolted against this and stopped it from happening. So, and also one of the best hospitals in the world was the Jewish hospital. This is where all the Nazis went to be treated, because the Jewish doctors were the best doctors in the world, and they were left alone. They remained there. The Jewish hospital stayed open throughout the entire war.
I read a book on this once, an academic book. I actually reviewed it, of the submarines, on submarines under the surface, or something like that it was called. It was about the situation of the U-boats in Germany. And a very interesting book, but it's such a strange, it is almost a surreal situation to imagine what it was like at the time. But it also throws up this kind of bizarre thing that the Nazis have about their self-image. There's all this talk of purity and order, and the reality is chaos and decadence and perversion and hypocrisy.
Yeah, it was a complete lie. I mean, just look at the master race. I mean, Hitler had dark hair. I mean, he was not Aryan in any way. So it was an invention. It was a distortion, and it's a distortion that's been picked up, unfortunately, in the United States, and it's horrifying as we have politicians who believe in the same kind of racism, and it's heartrending to see this happen in one's own country.
I got the feeling you kind of enjoyed actually exploding that in the book. Really making that point.
Oh yeah, no, yes, I did, because if you look at all the German masters like Goering, who was a dope addict, and really all he did was spend each evening looking at all his rings and jewels, and he spent most of the war at the Ritz Hotel in Paris. So this whole notion of a master race is just complete propaganda. When you look at Leni Riefenstahl's so wonderful. I mean, whatever you think of them.
Oh, it's beautiful, yeah.
Yeah, the images of what, you see Hitler in a completely different way. You see the way Hitler was adored, and I think Trump maybe needs a Leni Riefenstahl of his own to give him that kind of...
it's not going to be you.
No, I'm afraid it's not going to be me. But the thing is, what she's able to do, or what she was able to do, is because she could have 10 cameras from 10 different points of view. You just see the look of adoration on the faces of people when they see Hitler, in Nuremberg, and her film on the Olympics is extraordinary.
Okay, but if we take your central character, Canaris, who's not quite as black as Hitler in that sense, but I mean, a lot of writers get a lot of joy out of writing good characters and then, of course, giving them bad traits. This is sort of the opposite. This is writing a really bad character, but finding the good in him at the same time. It's a very complex man. This is a man who, as you said, first of all, did come up with the idea of the Yellow Star.
Yes.
But at the same time, he sued for peace during the war. He did try to save Jewish people during the war as well. And he did stand up against Hitler's policy of genocide.
And he also was one of the plotters, who tried to assassinate Hitler. So, it's the good and the bad. I mean, the ambiguity is what, I mean, if you have a character without ambiguity, you don't have a character, So it seems to me that the scene I love the most is when Eric is a cadet and he sees this old man,
yeah,
by the sea, an older sort of looking bum, and sort of saves him from being attacked. And we later learn that this old bum is Admiral
Canaris.
and you see the good in Eric, and he has to give Canaris money because his money has been stolen. And I didn't want to lose that scene, even though
That was a nice touch, by the way. Just a little bit with the money as well. It was a nice touch.
Yeah, I was reading that scene this morning, and I really liked the idea of seeing Canaris disheveled, and then later seeing him in his uniform. And he was a very ambiguous person because he was, even in the middle of the war, he was having peace talks in Switzerland. So there was a deep ambiguity. He was a Nazi, and at the same time, he had these other qualities that, I wouldn't say that redeemed him, because I don't think they redeem anyone, but on the other hand, you feel a kind of sympathy. He's Alta, he's the old man, you feel a kind of sympathy.
Yeah, I suppose it's the opposite. I always feel better about a villain about a good person when I know they've got feet of clay. It always makes me feel they're real.
Yes.
And there's something of that in this. This novel, you said how long it took you to write, and I can understand that. It's a very dark novel in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I mean, it's got poetry to it, and it reads like an adventure story. But at the same time, we end up in Theresienstadt.
Yes.
You've got the bombing during the war. You've got summary executions. We've got an overwhelming weight of the nastiness of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
The Holocaust, sorry. I'm just wondering, was that difficult to write?
That part of it was not difficult to write because I grew up with this. I grew up during World War II, and I always thought, when I went down, I was a kid, I was a baby, but on the other hand, I always thought that the Nazis would come down the next street, so they were very, very real to me. And when Roosevelt died, I mean, it was a god dying. He was president for like 150 years. It's like you couldn't get him out of the White House. So that I didn't have trouble dealing with Theresienstadt because it was a landscape, and as horrible as that landscape is, once you have the material of the landscape and you can put it together, you can construct it and reconstruct it. And there was a wonderful documentary about it. Sometimes you learn so much from documentaries. I recently saw one about Maria Callas, and now I'm going to write a novel about Maria Callas. So that it is you remain a little bit, you are, as the writer, you are amoral in some sense. You're not a moralist. You can't afford to be a moralist because otherwise your characters won't come alive. So your villains have to have a kind of energy. I always think of Richard III as the ideal character, with the hunchback and singing these wonderful lines and seducing these women. So it's the villains that I tend to identify with.
Well, and that's part of the point of the book. I mean, if we take the major characters, if you look at Canaris or you look at Eric or you look at Lisa, they all question themselves at some point throughout the book about, I mean, Canaris says, he says at the start, I'm not a monster. And then is forced to even reconsider that himself along the lines, and I am a monster.
It is monstrous, but also you can't forget that it is a love story. I mean, he falls in love with a young woman who's very, very arrogant, who's sadomasochistic, and yet they're able to is bisexual, and they're able to have a romance, and they end up a scene where even after both of them are dead, they're together. It doesn't really matter. I learned that from Pulp Fiction, where you can kill off a character and 10 minutes later bring him back to life. Why not? The dead are also alive.
Well, again, as you've mentioned it now, it was a very nice touch because what you had was a very dark ending that
Yeah.
kind of got a little bit of a lift as well. Gave you something
Well,
to go away with.
it gives me a shiver to read that because you know, these are ghosts walking across the bridge, and you have what they call Jewish jazz, and then they're dancing, and he's not going to go back to be killed again. He's going to stay where he is.
Can we talk about Lisa a little bit? Because her character, for me, is she's always there. When she's not actually on the page, she's still in the mind of everybody. She's in the book. Lisa is a shape-shifting character.
Yeah.
Lisa is, I mean, Lisa could be a communist. Lisa could be a Jewish resistance person. On the other hand, she could be a Nazi maiden. She's sexually liberated, but at the same time, she's also constrained by her sexuality. She's a very, very unusual character, but she's kind of a catalyst for everything that goes on with Eric.
Yeah, I think that it's a male's sort of adoration of the inability for the male to understand women. So, in other words, it's my testimony to that adoration is that she is everything. You know, she hates, she loves, she seduces, is seduced, and she's a very complex person in her own way, and also we see her dancing with another woman, and then we see her sort of taking care of this child in the concentration camp, and she becomes really the most powerful person in the book when she's in Theresienstadt.
Yeah.
And she's burnt alive. She comes back from the dead, and with all these scars on her face, and yet she doesn't lose her beauty. So that.
Oh, and won't ever forget Lisa, I'm sure of that. But you seem to like writing these strong women. You give women quite a presence. I mean,
I love strong women. I mean,
well, in Salinger, the same, really.
yeah.
The way that the women affected, but even somebody like Una, you put Una Chaplin in at the start,
Oh, yeah.
and then she reoccurs through the book.
Right.
She still has a fabulous presence, and it's still there all the time.
Oh yeah, yeah. If we talk about Sergeant Salinger, the thing is that I grew up with Salinger. You know, he was one of the first writers I read because everyone in high school was talking about him. It was in the 50s, and some of the parents of of the students knew him, and they said, Jerry, Jerry was there last night, and they said I looked like him. So that was because I have very big ears, so did Salinger. So it's interesting that at this stage I would write a novel about Salinger, but you go where your mind takes you. In some sense, you don't have any control.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's an incredibly different novel, but there are still themes that reoccur in the novel. Just to be clear about this for people, Salinger is released in January in the United States.
Yeah,
but I think we can say that you're probably going to have Salinger released in the UK as your next release after Cesare. Yeah, great. So people can look forward to that, and I can tell you it is quite a read. I'm just wondering, when you write about a writer, how much are you writing about the writer who inspired you, the writer that you have that love for, and how much of that is also about discovering about yourself as a writer?
That's a very evil question, Paul, because in a sense, every character you write about is yourself. So that even though it's a factual Salinger, it's also a fictional Salinger. And I just got I got a letter from a friend of mine who is also a writer, a very well-known writer, but I won't mention his name. But he said, well, you are, because he's called Sonny in the book. He said, well, you are Sonny. You become Salinger. And that was the greatest compliment. And he's the best writer in the United States. So, I mean, it was a compliment to me. But you become all the characters. I am also Lisa. That's what's interesting.
Mm.
And I'm also Canaris. I inhabit their worlds as my own. And I think that would be true of any novelist.
Mm.
You have to internalize. You have to get into the interior landscape of a character. Otherwise, they will never come alive. And you have to love them and hate them at the same time. Even the worst Nazis in the book, I can internalize them because I can get inside their skin. So the writer is a kind of ghoul. He or she, can sort of creep inside and creep outside. And as I said, I don't like the notion of a puppeteer because even though they are characters that I control, they also control me.
Mm. And I suppose that maybe that's even more true of real characters because there are certain boundaries you can't sort of play with. But
Yeah.
I got the sense that from this book, I mean, it's set around his time in the army, essentially.
Yeah.
So it's years, it's what, 10 years before he's actually written Catcher in the Rye.
Salinger was writing Catcher in the Rye during the war. He took the material with him. He went through, Normandy, right to the visiting, concentration camps. So what really shaped him as a writer was World War II, and he was also in a hospital, for several years, for several. So anyone who's read the story for Esme with Love and Squalor, I mean, that's really a totally autobiographical tale.
I mean, that's the point I wanted to get to, that this is about his wartime experience, and it's a traumatic wartime experience.
Yeah, terrible.
And I think there's a line in the novel, I never felt like a real soldier, and I wouldn't know how to be a civilian again.
Yeah.
Do you think that best sums up Salinger?
I think it does to some degree, but his his chrysalis, his formation as a writer. If you look at his early stories, and I was lucky enough to be able to see them, they're not good at all. They're not even interesting, and also no language, and they have no music. But once you go and look at the 9 stories that he wrote after the war, and you just pick up any of the stories, particularly for Esme with Love and Squalor, there's an immediate sense of music, of deep, deep sadness and trauma. And I think that's and anyway, it's the best war story ever written. You think of Mailer's novels, you think of James Jones's novels about World War II and the macho-ness of soldiers fighting the war. And this is so much deeper, so much more heartbreaking than those novels that try to deal with the so-called heroism. There's no heroism in war. There's only slaughter. There's
just mess.
Both sides. Yeah. And I think that's one thing that Salinger learned, and also since I studied his entire life, and the only friends he really had were buddies of his from the war. I didn't even know that he was a writer. Anything about him, but he would get together with them and reminisce about the war. He felt comfortable with them.
Well, when I finish up now, if we can, believe it or not, we've gone through nearly 50 minutes there. It's just flown, hasn't it?
Yeah.
But I wanted to say the couple of questions we have from people. How do you keep going with a book a year at your ripe old age? Well, that's a nice one.
Well, I don't do a book a year. It just seems that way because you're working on several things at the same time, so that it feels that way. But it's more like sort of when is it that you can really finish a book? It's just that there have been years when I couldn't write at all, being depressed. And there were other years, I remember I was teaching at Princeton, and I'd finished one novel, and I was on the train going out to Princeton, and I began a second novel the same day,
Right.
So when the music is with you,
Go with it.
you can't, you can't take anything for granted. What's there can also leave you. So while the music is there, you want to keep writing, but it's far from a novel.
So is Maria Callas next?
Yes, I finished the novel. I was doing. I wanted to do a novel on Orson Welles, and but I discovered that he was so full of himself that I couldn't do it from his point of view. And the more I read about Rita Hayworth, the more I liked her. She'd been taken advantage of as a child and really molested by her own father. So the book is called Big Red, and it's really about Rita Hayworth and Orson Welles, told from the point of view of a young woman who becomes her secretary, but is really a spy for Harry Cohn, who's the head of Columbia.
Yeah, right.
So I was very happy because I began writing that book during the lockdown, and I felt kind of sad when I finished it because we were still in the lockdown, and I had nothing to do. So I began to research something else, and then I saw this wonderful documentary on Maria Callas, and I fell in love with her. I mean, I would marry her, I would kill her, I don't know, I would do anything because she was extraordinary,
Yes.
powerful. And so I'm now researching a novel on, I'm going to call it the autobiography of Maria Callas.
I look forward to that. The next question, total change of subject. Somebody wants to know why you are so popular in France.
Well, that's a good question. What happened? I had written these detective novels, and they were published in a very popular series called the Série Noire. And my agent apologized. She said, well, I couldn't get them published anywhere else, so we gave them to the Série Noire.
That's gold standard.
Yeah, and I didn't realize that within 3 weeks, everyone had read them because they were so unusual. They were so unlike all other crime fiction because someone called them a combination of Groucho Marx and Dashiell Hammett. In other words, I was destroying the form and reinventing it. And I think
right.
French understand the sense of structure so that when I came to, someone came to interview me for a magazine a newspaper called Libération, and he told me that people were starting restaurants with the names of my characters. So in other words, it entered the culture like a kind of knife wound, very, very rapidly. And when that happens, it happens, but it doesn't happen too often.
But the French tend to have a very different relationship with their intellectuals anyway, don't they?
Yes.
I mean, in the sense that writers talk about elections and, they're always on the telly.
You'll see writers on television shows talking about politics, but we never see any writers talking about the election. Writers are invisible in the United States, except maybe for Stephen King, and I'm not even sure even Stephen King. We have no visibility, in this country. We have no real stature. It's very, very strange. We occupy a kind of hidden zone, but that's all right. It doesn't really matter.
Well, you'd have written anyway, wouldn't you?
Yes, because I wanted to be an artist, but I had no talent at all. So I began to draw with language, and I'm still doing it. And anyway, I'm still having fun. As long as I have fun doing it, I'm going to continue.
Okay, we'll leave you with this one. This is a question from Jack Baratta. And he asked, how do you figure out what a historical character's voice should sound like to the reader? E.g., Teddy Roosevelt seems both genuine and accurate within his internal dialogue.
Well, okay. First of all, you do a lot of research, and he did write several autobiographies. They were all boring. I mean, he had no music at all. So really, when the voice that I gave to Teddy Roosevelt is my voice with his texture. So in other words, you need to find a voice for the music to begin. And it is Teddy Roosevelt's voice, but it's really myself impersonating Teddy Roosevelt. So, or anyone else. What?
Is that okay?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say we met his great grandnephew, and he asked him a question. He said, "How did you get to somehow audio tape our conversations at home and have it sound exactly like our family?" And Jerome said, "Well, it's easy. I'm a novelist. It's my job."
No, you
Did
need
you
to
buy
find
that
the
answer?
music, and particularly, dealing with women, like everyone chided me for writing a novel in the voice of Emily Dickinson. Well, why couldn't I be? Because I happen to unfortunately be a male. Why should I not be able to enter the voice of a female? Because we are both sexes at the same time.
Yeah.
Now it's sort of verboten, but still, I mean, I love
No,
the voice of Emily Dickinson.
I mean, I think it's perfectly fine for writers to do that. It's just you stand or fall on the quality of the work. Then, though, if the voice is
In
false,
the United States, it's a little different in the United States.
I do understand. Jerome, we've got to wind it up now. It's been a brilliant chat. I want to thank everybody for listening. Just so people know, Cesare is out today, so congratulations on that in the UK. And because we did talk about Sergeant Salinger, that's out in January in the United States, but will be coming to Britain later in the year. So goodbye from us. Thank you very much, Jerome.
Thank you, Paul.
Been very brilliant. Bye.
Goodbye.